Open the podcast bay door as hell.
Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 142 of Welcome to Geektown. I'm your host, Kurt Onstead. I've been a proud geek all my life, being into role-playing games, board games, sci-fi, fantasy, and especially superheroes and comics. And I want to help others join me in those pursuits, but I found that sometimes people can get overwhelmed or feel left out because they don't already have what some consider the requisite knowledge to be considered a fan. And that's where Welcome to Geektown comes in. Here you can ask your questions without feeling like a gatekeeper is calling you out for not yet being fully versed in every aspect of your new interest. Listener, and former guest, Joel Levitz asks this week's question, which is on a topic I haven't touched on very much: anime and manga. Specifically, he's curious about some definitions. He writes, "What's the difference between anime and Japanese-style animation? Or is that purely a gatekeepers don't like the uninitiated kind of distinction? Is there a similar differentiation when it comes to manga?" For the completely uninitiated, anime and manga are the terms generally used for animation and comics that come from Japan, respectively. Both are hugely popular, with animated series like Pokemon, Dragon Ball Z, and others still drawing in viewers, while collected manga regularly outsells American comic book trade paperbacks in Western bookstores, and in Japan, multiple titles regularly sell in the tens of millions, compared to US comic sales, where the best-selling single issue was the 1991 X-Men #1 at 8.2 million copies, which was a huge outlier. Very few issues even breaking 1 million copies. If you look at sales charts today, only the few top-selling books each month break 100,000 copies sold to distributors. While I'm not going to go into a full history of animation in Japan, I do think it's important to acknowledge that they do have a history that dates back over 100 years. The first known work was created around 1907, and by 1917, publicly displayed animations were being produced by multiple artists. Unfortunately, many of those early productions were destroyed when a warehouse owned by anime pioneer Oten Shimakawa was destroyed in the 1923 Great Kanto earthquake. While many animated projects were created in the intervening years, it wasn't until the 1960s that anime first became widely seen on Western shores, with Astro Boy and Speed Racer leading the pack of imported cartoons. However, as art styles have influenced and been influenced between the Western and Eastern worlds, the definitions of what is anime and what isn't have gotten a little fuzzier. Let's see where we can draw some hard lines in there, while still leaving room for some blurry areas. To start with, when the word anime is used in Japan, it refers to any animated work, no matter its country of origin. If they want to specifically reference cartoons that come from their home country, they'll sometimes use the word Japanimation. Ironically, English speakers used to use Japanimation instead of anime, mostly in the 70s and 80s, but it has since fallen out of fashion in America and other places that import that animation. One reason that anime is probably a better word to use than Japanimation is that many popular anime works, and other animation, including parts of The Simpsons, are created in Korea in addition to the hundreds of studios in Japan. The Legend of Korra, Voltron Legendary Defender, Castlevania, and even classics like Princess Mononoke and Vampire Hunter D have been at least partially worked on by Korean studios. So, anime can cover any animation that originates from that side of the Atlantic, rather than a single country. But then, as I mentioned, many American shows and movies also depend on animators from Asia to complete their projects on time. But we definitely wouldn't call the real Ghostbusters, as an older example, anime, right? So what makes anime anime? Well, I think probably the most important distinction is going to be where the idea for the show or movie comes from, and or what language it was originally produced in. If the director slash showrunner or other head creative is from Japan, Korea, China, or another East Asian country, then it will probably be more accurate to refer to that project as anime, whereas shows that originate in America, Canada, France, or other Western nations, even if it's highly influenced by anime, should probably have its own term. If it comes from the West originally, but shares many of the visual hallmarks of manga or anime, then I would likely refer to it as Japanese-style animation, as Joel suggested. Castlevania is probably a good example of this. While it's based on a game by Japanese game studio Konami, the producers of the show were American, and their chief scriptwriter was from England. And of course, much of its iconography comes from Bram Stoker's work. In addition, while Korean studios Mua Film and Tiger Animation did a lot of work on the project, the main studio on Castlevania was Powerhouse Animation, located in Texas. The same is true for manga, the Japanese word for comics. Starting in the 80s, but especially in the 90s and onwards, a lot of artists from the West that were working on some of the most popular books of the time were heavily inspired by the manga that they had grown up reading. While I've heard some people refer to this as American manga, I personally would call it manga influenced, especially when it is being published by Marvel and DC, as while the art style is similar, some of the storytelling aspects, which I'll talk about in a moment, are definitively American. Some of my personal favorite artists among those include Humberto Ramos, Adrian Alphona, Adam Warren, and others. As I mentioned earlier, manga in Japan sells incredibly well, and unlike American comics, is not dominated by superhero stories. Instead, manga comes in many different genres, from romance to action to horror and everything in between. The broadest categorization involves who the target audience for the book is. Shonen is aimed at boys, and includes titles like Naruto, Dragon Ball, and other high-action stories. Due to American sensibilities of feeling that comics are for boys, these are the titles that were most commonly translated to English and brought to America first as books and cartoons. Seinen books, like Battle Royale, also often contain action, but are less cartoony and aimed at an older male audience. Then we have shoujo books, like Fruits Basket, that have a female protagonist and are generally sold to girls. There's often a strong romantic plot involved in these stories, but there can be action too, like in Sailor Moon. Older women will read josei books, with more mature plot lines and relationships. And of course, young kids have their own manga books, collectively referred to as kodomamuke. Once you've been exposed to a few manga/anime titles, or works inspired by them, it's not hard to identify other pieces that also belong. But what is it about those works that make them so distinct? And what are some commonalities among all manga/anime, despite the huge number of artists working in that field? Well, there are some that, while not completely universal, are extraordinarily common among the most well-known works. First off, there's the faces of the characters. Overly large, expressive eyes with small mouths are so ubiquitous that an anime-inspired role-playing game that came out in America is literally titled Big Eyes, Small Mouth. Another common trait is the wild swing between super detailed and cartoony art. Let me give an example. Let's say two characters are talking about a vase. In the first panel where the vase is brought up, you'll have a close-up on that vase, and you'll see all the details, often in an incredible lifelike simulation. However, if a character then picks up that vase and tries to hit the other character over the head with it, all of that detail will be left out, with the vase drawn in a simple outline. One of the main reasons for this is that manga stories tend to be longer, drawn-out tales compared to American comics, giving them room to have those panels that focus on a single object. American books usually have story arcs ranging from 4 to 12 issues, which means you tell a complete story in anywhere from 100 to 300 pages. In very rare cases, a writer will have ongoing plot threads that last through multiple story arcs, but that's the exception rather than the rule. On the other hand, manga tales can easily go on for 20 or more chapters. It's common in Japan for a manga title to be an anthology with multiple stories each getting one chapter per issue. And unlike American superhero comics, the same writer usually works on a title from beginning to end, so it's much more common for long-running plots to slowly unfold over years in the manga. And notice I did say end in that sentence. Most manga stories do reach a natural conclusion, and their stories come to an end. My favorite manga title growing up, Ranma 1/2, was published over 10 years from beginning to end. Dragon Ball went a similar length. Meanwhile, Superman, Spider-Man, and others have been going on for multiple decades, but with dozens of writers and artists working on them over that time frame. I won't say one is better or worse than the other. I love many of the Spider-Man stories told by writers and artists after Stan Lee and Steve Ditko left the book, but at the same time, I appreciate the long-form stories that can be told with a singular writer. I won't say singular artists, as manga titles are usually worked on by studios, albeit with one artist setting the style for each title, which allows characters to grow and change in ways that take them far away from their original portrayal, but in an organic fashion over time, just like real people do, until their story reaches its natural conclusion. That was a brief discussion of anime and manga, and the American titles inspired by it. If there's anything more specific you'd like me to go into in a future episode, or any other topic you'd like me to discuss, I'd love to hear from you. Longtime listeners will recognize some of the same question writers from past episodes, but I'd really like to hear from those who haven't yet submitted a question. Or just let me know what you think of the show in general. Please send all questions and comments to me via email at welcometogeektown, all spelled out, @gmail.com. Or you can go to the website, welcome to, the number 2 in this case, geektown.com, and click the Submit a Question link if you'd prefer to remain anonymous. Other contact options include facebook.com/welcometogeektown, Twitter @geektownpodcast, and Mastodon @welcometogeektown @mastodon.social. Also, if you'd like to support the show directly, why not become a patron at patreon.com/welcometogeektown for just $1 per month to get access to full scripts of the shows, audio outtakes, and a monthly shoutout. You can also help the show grow by subscribing and giving a 5-star review over on Apple Podcasts to join the Geektown City Council, which helps other people find the show, so we can all tell them, welcome to Geektown, population, us. Welcome to Geektown is written, narrated, edited, and produced by me, Kurt Onstead. Theme music is by Aaron Lovitz, logo art by Archie Santana. All other sound clips are the copyrighted material of their respective owners, and no infringement is intended, falling under fair use.